Hello everyone, Professor Krizlik here. I just wanted to make a quick video thinking about some of the reasons it's so difficult to find a ceasefire in Ukraine. So it might seem that every day there's new discussions about ceasefire. Donald Trump talking about we're close to a ceasefire. Or then Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying maybe we're not close to a ceasefire. And then Ukrainian authorities saying, oh, we are close to a ceasefire. And then Russian authorities saying, well, maybe we're close to a ceasefire. And maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not so obvious of why it's so hard to come to a ceasefire. And a big part of that is that all sides have their own self-interests. And that might seem obvious. The Ukrainians want something and the Russians want something. Of course, the Americans want something out of the peace plan. And so when you put all these sides together, it's quite complex. How complex of why it's so difficult to have a peace plan. So as outside observers, maybe many in the United States or in Europe look at the conflict and tell the Ukrainians, well, you might have to give up Crimea. The Russians want Crimea, maybe the Ukrainians have to give it up. And so on Friday and over the weekend, when there were discussions about that the US might recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and some sides of the political aisle seemed okay with that and supported that. And their rationale was that it would get us closer to a ceasefire, closer to lasting peace in Ukraine. And maybe from some parts of the American perspective, that makes sense if it's getting closer to a peace plan. But then we have to think about how that plays out in Ukraine, which we saw today. We saw that there was a pushback from Volodymyr Zelensky, from the Rada in Ukraine, from some parts of Ukrainian society, who are arguing that no, we don't want to give up this territory. We do not want to give up this land. This is Ukrainian territory. This is Ukrainian land. So clearly we have a difference here that isn't a minor difference. And so if we have this pretty sizable difference, it's going to make a ceasefire deal, a lasting ceasefire deal, quite difficult to come by. And then the Russians. If there's not maybe some territory given to the Russians or some territory recognized as part of Russia, maybe some of the 20% of Ukraine that the Russians currently control. If there's not some agreement that the Russians can hang on to that land or continue to control that land, they might not sign a peace deal, and they might not sign a cessation of hostilities deal. And so when Donald Trump was campaigning and said he would end the conflict within 24 hours, even if he wasn't being serious that, okay, it's going to be 24 hours and then the war's over, even if he just meant that it would be quickly over, that once his administration came in, there would be an end to the conflict relatively quickly. Even if we give him the benefit of the doubt, now that he's in office and the policies actually have to be implemented, it's running into the reality, and this isn't a critique of the Trump administration, this is just saying that actually getting all sides together to find an agreement is extremely difficult because each side, of course, has their own interests in what they hope to get out of a peace plan, a long-term peace plan, which is another thing. The Ukrainians are generally scared that even if there's a ceasefire, if there's no security guarantees that the Ukrainian territory will be at least protected or aided by the U.S., Western Europe, that the Russians will just rearm and invade again down the road. So if you're in Kyiv, if you're a Ukrainian policymaker, if you're Volodymyr Zelensky, you're thinking about this. You're concerned about this. Okay, if there's an agreement today, How do I have an idea that the Russians won't invade again in the future? So without those security guarantees, Kyiv is much less likely to agree to a ceasefire because they're just worried. And then if you're Russia and you're at the table and you're thinking, well, okay, how do we find an agreement we can agree to? They're far less likely to agree to a deal that has security guarantees down the road. And so we hear a lot about NATO, a debate over the expansion of NATO eastward, this debate over Ukraine joining NATO. Russia, those in Moscow, are absolutely against any potential for Ukraine to join NATO in the future. So we're starting to see just the complexities of ending this conflict, and we start to understand why, because each side has their own self-interest. And maybe all sides want to see the end of the conflict. Maybe even Russia wants to see an end to the conflict. Ukraine, of course, wants to see an end to the conflict. I think we can agree the US wants to see an end to the conflict. But how do these three sides, and then the Europeans as well, how do all sides come together and agree and find an agreement of how to end the conflict where everyone can agree and at least not hate the agreement? So we're starting to see this difficulty and why it's so hard to find an agreement and an end to this conflict. Thank you.